Okay, this is one of the last picker camps left on the peninsula that's reasonably intact. And this is what they came up with during the 50s after they moved out of tents and out of the barns where they stayed before that. And they came up with these small buildings. They're kind of small buildings, but there would be as many as 5-6 people in each one. And I would say that this camp probably held 20 to 30 people. In a building this size, you would generally have mom and dad's bed on the left or right. On the other side of the room, 2, 3 high for the children, because they all had big families, at least depending on their age, they'd have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 kids. And then in the center, along the back wall, there was a little pantry-like shelf thing with 2 or 3 burner kerosene burner stove. And it was a little metal frame. It had 2 burners or 3 burners. And on the left side of it was a big glass jug that held the kerosene. Now, why they used a glass jug for their kerosene next to a flame, I don't know. But a few of these shacks burned down because of it. And usually, when they started with putting them indoors in these picker quarters, everything that went out of their farmhouses and everything ended up here. And there would be the old refrigerators were usually 1 or 2 around here to the camp. You could keep things cold in, and they were the type of refrigerator. They're about this high, and then they had the big round compressor thing on top. The very first refrigerators, and they all ended up in the picker camp. And 1 or 2 of these places, or probably that one over there, one of these, would have a shower stalls in it for them to clean up. And before that, they used the bay. And that was pretty much it. They would get up at dawn, get out in the orchard, and come in at sunset. And there would always be music playing. There's always in Spanish. And there's usually a communal fire pit somewhere, and they would gather around at night. And it was like a festive type feeling around camps at that time. It was a nice place to hang out. This was the shower building, because you see it has a water tap, so this is probably the communal shower building. There'd be 2 or 3 stalls for women and 2 or 3 for men. And that's how it kept clean. In the beginning, in the early 30s when the orchards were going in, they planted the orchards, and then they needed somebody to harvest the cherries. So in the beginning on the Bursaw farm, which is what I know best, their history is, the first cherry pickers that came up to the Bursaw farm before the war, late 30s, they were eastern coal miners out of Ohio, and people from Oklahoma and Arkansas. I'm assuming they were refugee leftovers from the Dust Bowl and came this far north to get work. And they were all white, and they picked cherries till World War II. That's who the crew was on the Bursaw. When the war started, everybody went off to war, so the farmers were left again without somebody to harvest the cherries. And I want to say that those early people from Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Ohio, they slept in the barn. up in the hayloft, or some of them brought their own tents. And there was an outhouse, and they would wash up in the bay. That's how it was. When World War II came along, all the men went off to war. They were left without a labor force. That's when they started getting people from Mexico would come up here to pick the cherries. And none of them spoke English. And there usually was somebody in the crew that had some broken English and they could communicate a little bit. But it didn't take much, you know. Box, ladder, search the cherries, you know, potato on Saturday. But one time, the story goes, my grandpa's crew from Mexico, they would send a truck down there to pick them up and bring them up here. Nobody spoke English. One day it was Saturday and they got the afternoon off, and my grandpa was standing there and a bunch of them flocked around him, were talking to him in Spanish, and he was just going, he didn't understand them. He said, yeah, okay. Oh yeah, yeah. And so he turned around to give the cows some feed, and he turned back and they all jumped in his pickup and drove away. Didn't know where they were going or what they were doing, but apparently they went to town, went shopping, and that was what the discussion was. So then they turned back up late in the afternoon. But other than that, they got along fine. And then after the war, that didn't happen anymore, and we started getting, my grandpa's crews came from Saginaw, and they worked in the Chevrolet stamping plant. And of course they had relatives back in Texas where they came from. So they would always contact their Texas family. And half of the crew up here at my grandpa's farm was from Texas. The other half was from Saginaw. And the people from Saginaw, the Texas people would pick their way all the way from Texas north to the cherry orchard. And then there wasn't much left going into the north. They'd turn around and harvest their way back to Texas. The Saginaw part of them would take their vacation in the summer during cherry season from the carpool. And if they got a week off, then his brother would get the next week off, and they would stagger it out so there was always their family up here picking cherries for the whole season. And that worked out really good. Most of them spoke English. There was always a crew boss who came with them. And they stayed in the early days in Army surplus tents after the war. And I'm talking big tents that would hold, 15 people. And you would drive around the peninsula and you would see hundreds and hundreds of these tents, because there was thousands of pickers set up around the barnyards and whatnot, because that's where the water was. And then from there, it moved into the powers that be started requiring the farmers to provide a little more amenities for cherry pickers. You can't have 20,000 people going down to the bay and washing their hair and stuff and literally leaving a soap stud ring all the way around the peninsula every day, that's where they went. So they required them to have running water, and then it progressed from there, no more outhouses. In the late 50s, they required indoor toilets, and you have a situation like you have here. And in the early 60s, the cherry shaking came into being, and they were phased out. And that was the end of the migrant era. I'd like to add that because of the influx, and they were all pretty much Mexican people, which is what the term they went by back then. In third grade at Old Mission, every class in third grade took a year of Spanish, so that they could talk to them basically and tell their parents what they're saying if nobody spoke English. So that was required in third grade. And the first thing they taught us was how to sing America the Beautiful in Spanish. And I'll never forget that. I can sing it to this day. And that's about it. I explained the early onset of the cherry shaking thing. It just came on in the early 60s. The process was first, they'd have a shaker hooked on a tractor that stripped each limb. And they'd lay out big metal pans, probably 3 feet wide, 2 feet, 2.5 feet wide, maybe 15 feet long, 10 feet long. They'd lay them at length under the tree. And they'd put 2 canvas aprons with round aluminum frames on them, like a trampoline cut in half. And then they would set those next to the pan, and then they would shake the trees, the cherries would fall down in the pan. And then they'd pick these big pans up full of cherries and dump them into a water tank trailer. They would take the water tank trailer somewhere where they had a good well. The cherry processors would set up these great big huge tanks. And you turn the spigot on your water tank trailer, it would run under these big tanks. And they were up in the air on one side of the barn, and they dug down so the semi truck could back their tanker up to the other low side of it and turn the spigot, and it would all run into the tanker truck. And that's how this thing went, because there wasn't enough water for the cherry shaking operation in the beginning. I mean, there was enough to feed the cows. The well was big around, you know, but there wasn't enough to support the cherry shaking operation. It took a lot of water. And so from there, it went to processing plants, put in big wells, and then you could go fill up your cherry tanks there and take them back to the orchard, fill them up with cherries. At this point, they had a rollout with a conveyor in the middle, and you roll the tarp out from the conveyor under the tree. A self-propelled shaker would come in, shake them on the tarp. Tarp would roll into the conveyor trailer, go run back up and into the cherry tank, and they just switch the tanks, load the trucks up, and go back to the processor. Nowadays, from there it progressed to, they have a cherry shaker with an umbrella, upside down umbrella thing that goes around the tree, shakes into a conveyor that's hooked to it, goes into a tank, and they just switch tanks, and it's all one man self-contained. It takes 2 people to shake an orchard and a forklift. And they take them to their own cooling pads now and keep them cool, because they have to keep the cherries cool each turn until they go to the processor. And that's where the cherry industry is at today, although I would say most of it, the cherry orchards are gone now. Either subdivisions are being replaced with grapes. So I see in the near future that cherries will probably be replaced by grapes, just like potatoes with a crop out here that got replaced by cherries. I'd also like to add that my experience with going up to the picker camps, and I was a little kid, probably 4 years old when I started going up there and pretending to pick cherries for my grandpa. But me and my older brother were around the orchard all the time, and we would always go back at lunchtime to the picker camps. And I don't know how it worked out. I think the migrant mothers there took turns on who was going to feed us. Because we always went up there, and one of them would call us over to their camp, and they would have some tortillas for us that they cooked on this kerosene stove. And man, they were good. They were the real deal. And we played with the kids all the time. Went down to the bay after work and jumped around with them and stuff. And they always took the cherry ladders down, the big tall ones, 12 foot, put them in the bay, to dive off of out there, 8 foot of water. And at the end of every season, my grandpa would throw a big party in the yard of the farmhouse. They would all come down and we'd have homemade ice cream, cake, a few beers here and there, and that was the end of the season. But it was fun time. They were great people. Great people. They were all fairly staunch religious people. Kids were well behaved, and they smiled all the time.
So Tim mentioned that you know, it was really thousands of migrants that you know, migrated to this area, and most of them were families with small kids. And so, you know, I was born in 1960, and so I grew up, you know, sort of at the end of the migrant worker era. In the 70s, we got the first cherry shakers, so migrants started to phase out. But yeah, some of my best friends were actually some of the migrant worker kids. We, you know, spent a lot of time in the orchard with them, and just got to be really good friends with some of the kids. Also, I know that when we had a crew boss, Lupe was his name, and so he and my dad worked pretty closely. My dad was Walter Johnson, and my brothers Dean and Ward Johnson still farm a lot of land out here. And I know Dean said that when the cherry shakers came in, it was really hard for my dad because the migrants were, you know, sort of the lifeblood of the farms out here. And so it was hard for Dad because he felt a responsibility to those workers, and he, you know, was pretty close with the crew chief and the bosses. So the shakers were a hard transition for him. But about that time, he was kind of getting out of farming, and, you know, of course he drove a tractor right up until the day he died, but my brothers Dean and Ward took over the farms, and that's kind of when the shakers came in. One other thing is that when they came up, they had huge trucks, and so there was a lot of migrants loaded into the trucks, but they also had these amazing cars, big cars, giant cars like we didn't see on the peninsula. Lime green, cherry red, I mean, they were amazing colors of cars, and so that was pretty cool to see those. And yeah, I think that's about it. Oh, the tents. Tim mentioned the giant Army surplus tents. So we had those, but of course, by the time I came along, they had transitioned to, you know, some of the housing like you see here. But we still had a lot of those tents, and so when my cousins came up from Virginia, my mom was from the south, so they would come up in the summer, and my dad would put up one of those big tents in the yards, and so all the cousins and me and my siblings, we would sleep out in those tents and tell ghost stories and whatnot. So that was a fun summer memory. So yeah, that's about it as far as my memories. Like Tim said, they were just a really happy people and smiling all the time. You'd hear them singing Mexican songs up in the tops of the trees, and it was good. Good memories.
My name is Leo Canas, and I came here in the early 50s to pick cherries. I was 8 years old, and we were getting 35 cents a lug of cherries at that time. Now they get $3.50. And we came here for 5 or 6 weeks of cherries, then go back and find some other work on tomatoes or whatever, and then come back for apples. And
prodigious. I can remember driving down the road and the panel trucks that were just full of people standing up, and this was, you know, before we even had seatbelts, so it was a pretty wild scene. But panel trucks of people standing up, riding around, going from orchard to orchard. I can remember on Friday and Saturday evenings, down at what is now the Boathouse, Refined Boathouse Restaurant, which until about 10 or 12 years ago was a store, which 20, 30, 40 years ago, the side of that store was a very long, open-sided ice cream bar. Ice cream and sodas, and there'd be 2 or 3 or 4 people working down there, and the lines of the kids from the migrant families that came down there with their nickel or their quarter to buy pop and ice cream. It was just a wonderful sea of people. They were all excited, and they, maybe they were too young to be working, but the family gave them a little something, and otherwise they'd been out working. And the scenes in the orchards, you had whole families that would be working together, and it was a very wonderful culture to be around. Very hard labor. Very intense focus on getting the job done and getting the job done well. And I can remember even up into the 70s, one of my jobs on the farm was going around and picking up fruit from other farms because we were a little bit of a distributor. I can remember pulling up to farms and if late at night, and you'd have a scene with a number of cabins around an open area, and in the middle a bonfire, and music playing, and people dancing. And this was probably, like a Friday or Saturday night when after a long week, and so they were really relaxing. But this beautiful culture of young people and older people who had worked their tails off all week, celebrating, and all the Spanish voices and the Spanish-influenced music going on. It was just fabulous. Now we're at the point where, again, you still have these wonderful laborers who do as good a job or better job as anybody could, who are often descendants from those migrant families or actively, migrant legal members of the working farm community. But the numbers are considerably reduced.
My name is Keith Evans. I was the regional director for migrant education programs from 1965 through 1980. Our programs encompassed the 5 counties, starting at Manistee and working north. And in the various counties, we established programs during the harvest season. And normally, the high point was for the cherry harvest. And in order to serve the number of migrant families and children that were here, we ended up with a total of 10 schools in those 5 counties. And at the height of our service to migrant families, we had over 4,000 children. That includes daycare, nursery, up to about age 14. The older children would be helping the families harvest, so they were normally not in school, but we did hire some who could speak both Spanish and English as aides in the school, and I'm sure they were paid more than they could have earned picking cherries, because many of the families determined how much the kids would get paid based on what the parents decided to pay them to help.
This is one of the last picker camps left on the peninsula that's reasonably intact. And this is what they came up with during the 50s after they moved out of tents and out of the barns where they stayed before that. And they came up with these small buildings. And you see that they're kind of small buildings, but there'd be as many as 5, 6 people in each one. And I would say that this camp probably held 20 to 30 people. And this is an example of how they were laid out inside. A building this size, you would generally have mom and dad's bed on the left or right. And these were constructed out of 2x4s with straw tips on them. There would generally be bunk beds on the other side of the room. 2, 3, tie to the children because they all had big families. They were, depending on their age, they'd have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 kids. Then in the center along the back wall there was a little pantry-like shelf thing with 2 or 3 burner kerosene burner stove. And it was a little metal frame. It had 2 burners or 3 burners. And on the left side of it was a big glass jug that held the kerosene. Why they used a glass jug for their kerosene next to a flame, I don't know. But a few of these shacks burned down because of that. And usually, when they started with putting them indoors in these picker quarters, everything that went out of their farmhouses and everything ended up here. And there would be the old refrigerators were usually 1 or 2 around here. And these things folded. They were the type of refrigerator that was about this high that they had the big round compressor thing on top. The very first ones. They all ended up here. And 1 or 2 of these places, and probably that one over there, one of these would have a shower stall in it for them to clean up. And before that, they used the bay. And that was pretty much it. They would get up at dawn, get out in the orchard, and come in at sunset. And there would always be music playing. Always kids standing. And there's usually a little fire pit somewhere they gather up at night. And it was like a festive type feeling around camps at that time. It was a nice place to hang out.
More than double. There was estimates of 12 to 16,000 workers in the township. During the cherry harvest, and instead of being a 2 or 3 week harvest, it was 6.
It was really thousands of migrants that, migrated to this area, and most of them were families with small kids. And so, I was born in 1960, and so I grew up, sort of at the end of the migrant worker era. In the 70s, we got the first cherry takers, so migrants started to phase out. But yeah, some of my best friends were actually some of the migrant worker kids, and spent a lot of time in the orchard with them, and just got to be really good friends with some of the kids. Also, I know that when we had a crew boss, Luthe was his name. And so he and my dad worked pretty closely. My dad was Walter Johnson, and my brothers Dean and Ward Johnson still farm a lot of land out here. And I know Dean said that when the cherry takers came in, it was really hard for my dad because the migrants were, sort of the lifeblood of the farms out here. And so it was hard for Dad because he felt a responsibility to those workers, and he, was pretty close with the crew chief and the bosses. So the takers were a hard transition for him. But about that time, he was kind of getting out of farming, and of course he drove a tractor right up until the day he died. But my brothers Dean and Ward took over the farms, and that's kind of when the Shakers came in. One other thing is that when they came up, they had huge trucks, and well, there was a lot of migrants loaded into the truck, but they also had these amazing cars, big cars, giant cars like we didn't see on the peninsula. Lime green, cherry red, I mean, they were amazing colors of cars, and so that was pretty cool. Tents. Tim mentioned the giant Army surplus tents. So so we had those, but of course, by the time I came along, they had transitioned to, you know, some of the housing like you see here, but we still had a lot of those tents. And so when my cousins came up from Virginia, my mom was from the south, so they would come up in the summer, and my dad would put up one of those big tents in the yards. So all the cousins and me and my siblings, we would sleep out in those tents and tell ghost stories and whatnot. Like Tim said, they were just a really happy people and smiling all the time. You'd hear them singing Mexican songs up in the tops of the trees, and it was good.
One of the things I'm really aware of is the way that the families of the migrant families connected and became a part of the fabric of the life of the farm families in a very consistent way. And I know it in two ways. One, I know that my uncle Ellis and Aunt Ann Wunsch would go south to Mexico almost every, well, I can't say if it was every winter, but frequently, and stay with the families that came up here to work for them. So they really developed a close relationship. But I also know it from the farm that I now own, which was the Pratt farm, and before that was a Marshall farm, which now we have an orchard on there, and we harvest it from our home farm. But 3 years ago maybe, a van drove up and a man came out and introduced himself to me, Mike Bueno. And Mike is a teacher down in Indiana. But he talked about and started telling me how when he was young, his whole family came up here. And he was too young to work on the harvest, but they would come and stay on that Pratt farm. And the farm still has living quarters that are no longer being used in the end of one of our long barns that was a packing shed. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other buildings, there are 6 other buildings that are still there that were all living quarters. And he told me that his uncle was the lead migrant laborer for the family, and would come up every spring in about April to start getting the buildings ready and getting it all prepared, at least by early May, and working for Mrs. Pratt and helping her get the whole place together. And then slowly the whole family would come up, and his grandparents would come up, and he told them, well, my grandparents stayed in that building, and my uncle stayed in this building, and I can remember sitting under this tree and watching the whole family work. And he said, all those buildings there that you have were built by my uncle and my father. They came up here and put all of those together, and he was able to tell me that originally there were 3 more in each row and show me where they'd been. So it was really fun to see that evolution and to see how important it was to him to connect with us. So the next year he came back and he brought his sister. And I gave him the same tour and went all over the farm and told us all about the wonderful experiences they had and how hard everybody worked, but how that was coming to Traverse City for their migrant family, and I've heard this from other migrant families, was the primo gig, because you start down in the southern part of the state working other crops, work your way north, get up here, and then later follow the crops back into other areas. But when they get here, it was the peak of summer, they were around all this beautiful water, they could go swimming. I know on our farm we have beach frontage, and there'd always be 20, 30, 40 migrant laborers coming down to the beach at the end of the day to cool off. So it was definitely a place that they looked forward to being, and definitely long-standing relationships like the one my aunt and uncle had with the families they would stay with years later in Mexico, and the one that Michael Bueno's family had, where 3 generations were here working at once, and where his uncle and father built the migrant labor camp that they all stayed in. Definitely tells a story of human connection through the industry.